Thanks. Good morning again, everyone. As co-chair of the policy committee, I will call the meeting to order this morning, February 16, 2022. So good morning again to my fellow directors and administrators. As we start, I'd like just to take a moment, just really to start our meeting with acknowledgement and honor. It is Black History Month, and we can not just during Black History Month, but we can certainly acknowledge the many legacies that have contributed to all of us on this call this morning, the legacies of settlement, the legacies of displacement, violence, hope, resilience, all those things that really have contributed to us and our community. And so as we move forward, I will take roll in alphabetical order. I see Ms. Julie Haywood.
I'm present.
Ms. Leah, and that is the committee members. We do, and myself, Zachary, we do welcome Ms. Mulhern to the policy committee meeting this morning. With that, we do have to move to approval of minutes. So I guess as a point of information, is that an action that we would need a quorum for, or can we take action on the approval of minutes?
Yeah, Mr. Diazio, we only have 2 of the 4 committee members, so I understood that we could not approve the minutes until we actually had a quorum.
Yes, that's correct. That's procedurally correct. I see that Ms. Lohman just joined, but I don't think that's one of the members you were waiting for, correct?
No,
correct.
But we welcome her.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Are you anticipating someone else joining?
Yes, 2 other people joining and just text them, so haven't heard back.
Okay. I would simply skip the minutes for now and come back to them if a quorum is reached.
Okay, and just as another point of information, if needed, would we then need to revisit it at the next policy committee meeting to approve? Okay, cool, awesome. Thanks. All right, well then we will table the approval of minutes for now and move forward to the presentation. So I'll hand it over to Ms. Tolbert-Jackson and Mr. Diazio for today's presentation.
Mr. Diazio, do you want to share your screen for
Yes.
live updates?
Yes, I can do that. Let's see. All right.
So the first policy under old business 006 meetings.
Is my Zoom screen in the way of, or can you see all of the language in 006 here? Okay, good.
Yeah, we see the language and not the Zoom information.
Okay, good. All right, 006 is up, and I think these are our second readings.
Yes, policy 006 is up for adoption at the March 8th board meeting.
And hopefully the committee members saw, since there were a number of changes to several of the policies that are being discussed today, I hope the committee saw that we put together a bullet point list of many of the changes that were made since the last meeting. And I think everything is reflected in this new version of 006, but if there's any additional questions, I'm certainly happy to address them now.
I see Ms. Going to comments from the board. See Ms. Haywood hands raised. Ms. Haywood.
Yes, thank you. It's really not a question, but just a request for the parliamentary authority. I know that we use O. Garfield Jones parliamentary procedures at a glance, and I'm not sure if all of the board members have copies of that. Is it possible to get a copy for every board member to have a copy, or if we can get it electronically, that would even be great. It's a lot smaller.
Yes,
So, it just, not that we're going to necessarily refer to it all the time. Probably, Mr. Diazio, we would defer to you for interpretation, but it probably would be good for all the board members to have a copy as a reference point.
yes, we can do that. No problem. I just
Great,
need myself a note.
thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Haywood. Seeing no other hands raised, including from members of the public. This will move forward for adoption at our legislative meeting. We can move forward to the next policy item.
The next policy is 903, public participation in board meetings. This is also up for adoption in the March 8th legislative board meeting.
Yes, and the same thing with this one. We had good discussion on this policy last month, and it's here for adoption at the next meeting.
I will move to board comments and questions. And welcome Mr. Burdell Williams. Currently, did see when you joined the meeting. Currently discussing policy around public participation, 903, public participation in the board meetings. Seeing no hands raised, and I don't see any members of the public now. This will move forward to the March 8th agenda for adoption, and we can move forward to the next policy.
Policy in AR 922, civility. This is also up for adoption, the March 8th legislative board meeting.
Okay, and the same thing here. Some changes were made, minor changes were made since the last meeting. And it's here for second adoption at the next board meeting.
All right, thank you to you both. Checking for board comments or questions. Ms. Haywood?
Yes, Mr. Epps, could Mr. Diazio, could you pull up the AR, the 922 AR? I think I had him. So I couldn't remember. Is there text in the complaint and resolution procedures related to any misconduct by parents? Just yeah. So I was wondering in here, when we give the examples of complaints and recommended responses, if we should add a complaint if an employee and or a teacher and or a parent is reported uncivil actions towards a parent by an administrator. I know that was not included here, and I'm sure that would never happen, but just to cover all bases in terms of the recommended response to that.
And you said a complaint by an employee, including a teacher or a parent.
Mm-hmm. Who believes that
Alleging something
administrators
along the
can't-
lines of like an administrator being uncivil towards a parent.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, we can certainly add that.
Again, I'm
I
sure
mean,
that.
I almost
not
wondered,
happen.
would it make sense in number one to say a teacher or administrator is alleged to be uncivil toward a parent? Would that simple change address that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that right now, if the rest of the committee's okay with that.
I do see Dr. Smith's hand raised. Is it something where I'll recognize you in response to this?
Good morning. Mr. Diazio, I was wondering if rather than a teacher or administrator could be replaced with district staff member to kind of cover the gamut of all district employees, because somewhere else in the policy it says district employee. So maybe we should be consistent with the language and say district employee as opposed to a teacher or administrator.
Yeah, I think that's actually more comprehensive because there are staff members aside from teachers and administrators, right? There's support staff, there's, other professionals. Is the committee okay with that?
So I guess my reaction to that would be, when we're talking about civility, I do think it's probably important for a parent to have at least, I think a teacher or district staff would be fine, but I think a teacher should be included only because that's going to be probably the most possible occurrence of uncivil action by a district staff member towards a parent. And so I think it's important for a parent to know who they should seek the intervention of under those circumstances.
Thank you, Ms. Haywood. Ms. Mulhern, is your comment in response to this or?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes, directly. No, as I was listening, and I appreciate both Dr. Smith and Ms. Haywood's points about clarifying teacher, but also all staff. And I'm wondering, what about those that are in our buildings that were, when we contract with someone, are they, for the sake of like this policy, would they be considered Cheltenham employees? Does it cover them even though they do not work directly for the district? They work for someone else that we've contracted with. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's a great example of times when other people are in the buildings. They wouldn't necessarily be considered our employees, they'd be our contractors.
Right.
And again, these examples were just 3 examples. They weren't capturing every possible scenario. But the policy would apply to them, and contractors would certainly be obligated to comply with this policy.
Okay, thank you.
So I heard maybe leaving the language, say a teacher or district staff member. That's what I think I heard Ms. Haywood say.
I did mishear that as well. I would also be in favor of broad language that just encompasses any employee that would be in the building, and certainly hear Ms. Mulhern's about contractors as well.
Another way to say it would be a district employee or contractor is alleged. That's another way to say it as well, if that's something that resonates with the committee.
Dr. Smith?
I agree with that, Mr. Diazio.
Okay.
Ms.
Ms.
Stolber
Haywood,
Jackson?
would that address your, is that broad enough for to address your concerns?
Sorry, Mr. Giazzo, were you directing that to me?
Yes. Would that be sufficient?
Yes, it would be. Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Stolber Jackson?
Yes, in number 2, it says a bus driver, and a bus driver is a contracted employee. So would that be the place to put a bus driver or other contractor employee of the district? Some language similar to that?
So I think, and I'm just reading this here, and I'm actually wondering if why in number 1, it talked about teachers only, was because the response was that it would go to the principal. If it's a bus driver, it should go to the supervisor of transportation. I think that the scenarios we're trying to show that when you have a complaint, you go to the person that's nearest to supervising the area where that individual operates. So while a bus driver is one example of a contractor, if we contract out a one-to-one aid service, I don't know that we would want the response to go to the supervisor of transportation. So I think these examples were intended to show, depending on where the type of complaint originates, who should be the person that you contact. So I'm actually wondering, though, in response to Ms. Jackson's comment and rereading number 1, I actually think we should adjust the recommended response to say parent or guardian should seek the intervention of the principal or the district employee's immediate supervisor. Because if you have a district administrator, for example, that's alleged to be uncivil towards a parent, the response we wouldn't want that response going to a building principal. We would probably want that complaint going to the central office administrator that oversees the administrator. So if it was a complaint against a principal, maybe it should go to Dr. Smith's office. If it was a complaint against a cabinet member, it should probably go to Dr. Scriven. So I almost wonder if we need to tweak the response in number 1 as a result of the change that we made.
I would agree with that.
Dr. Smith?
I was just jumping in to say I agree.
Thank you both. Any comments from board members in terms of that proposal? Ms. Haywood?
So my only pushback to that is that the purpose of this policy, I would think, would be to be transparent to anyone who's reading the policy, including obviously parents and students and district employees. And I would be a little more comfortable, I think, adding that language to number 1 and deleting number 2 takes out the example that's real to parents when they have a complaint about a bus driver. And so I would be more comfortable either putting in a parenthetical in number 1 or retaining number 2 and putting in a district employee, a contractor like a bus driver is reported to be uncivil towards a parent or student, and then keeping the recommended response, because that's very specific to the supervisor of transportation where the complaint would be made. Those are just my thoughts.
And I had always envisioned, Ms. Haywood, of keeping number 2. I was only thinking of adding to number 1.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
A statement here that said the principal or supervisor, immediate supervisor. But yeah, I agree. I think number 2 is a good example here.
Okay, great. I just misunderstood. I thought we were deleting number 2. Thank you. I'm fine with that change then.
All right, thank you, Ms. Haywood. And so it sounds like we have a consensus now of adding language to the first example and keeping the other, and the rest of the language will remain. In terms of, does that constitute a substantive change in terms of?
This is okay because this is just the administrative regulation.
Okay. And so the 920, if checking for any members of the public. So seeing as we've resolved that discussion, 920, the policy 922 will move forward for March 8th adoption. And we can move forward to 604.
604 is also up for adoption at the March 8th board meeting. That's the last policy under old business.
Yes, and there were no revisions to this since the last policy committee meeting.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Diazio. Another policy we had a pretty rich discussion last month around, and so checking to see any comments or questions from board members, board directors. And also not seeing any from the public. This will also move forward for 604 will move forward for action on March 8th, board action on March 8th. And as Ms. Jackson said, we'll move forward to old business. I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, the first policy is policy NAR 803, school calendar. And Ed, if I'm correct, the policy was adopted in 2019, so there's no changes in the policy, but the AR.
That's correct. So actually, it's just the AR that's on the agenda. I'll bring up the policy for a moment, just so that it's a pretty simple policy. Essentially requires administration to put together a calendar that complies with the school code requirements and present it to the board, sometime in the fall. At the time, there was a lot of discussion around so that the community could plan for the start of school. At the time, the committee had asked for guidance in an AR about when school would start based on when Labor Day fell. And at the time, we did a lot of analysis on what some other school districts were doing. And we came up with a recommendation at the time. This was obviously when Dr. Marseille was still the superintendent. And I'm not sure that this AR was ever presented and tabled, or if it was prepared and not presented because the calendar for the year in question was just about to be released and we didn't think the timing was good. But I wanted to make sure we circled back because this was still an open item that had never been resolved. So what's here on the screen is simply a draft. This was what was going to be recommended by administration back in 2019. I know there's been a lot of discussions about the calendar since then, and obviously Dr. Smith is here. So if there's questions, I think her input would be helpful. Dr. Scriven's input as well, but that's the context and the background for this AR.
Dr. Smith?
Yeah, just as a just to give a little context, we never really moved forward with this. This was something we never used. This was actually something proposed by a former board member to consider as something we could do around the calendar, but it was decided, to Mr. Diazio's point, that it would be more advantageous for our community if we took a stand of pre or post Labor Day, as opposed to the specific numbers, the specific dates, because it would require families to basically check the policy or check the calendar for these dates. And it seemed to be a little complicated. So this was something that we never moved forward with. It was, again, presented as a recommendation by a board member, but it never went any further than that.
Thank you for the context. I'll just check because I saw your hand raised. Is that Mr. Burdell Williams? Do you want to make a comment, or I did see you lower your hand? Okay, Mr. Burdell Williams.
Yeah, so quick. Well, it actually wasn't in reference to the AR, but I do recall the discussions that we had then about, how we could like formalize, the calendar, to benefit families. And so I didn't like specifically have a comment to that end, but I am asking, I guess the question is like, does administration feel like we still need to have, this specific AR, or do we want to change the language to pre or post Labor Day, and what that would look like?
So I would say, since we've never used this or ever followed this hasn't been something we've practiced at all. I don't think we need this particular AR. I think we stick with the language that basically requires administration to present to the board the calendar to be, approved by that December meeting, as we've done in the past.
Yeah, which I do appreciate that. And I recall that specific revision being done, because I think in the past, we may have had like a calendar approval in like March. And I think that was like late for some families, and we did get community feedback. And I recall actually administration going out to the community for recommendations about the calendar, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're absolutely right. And we did the same thing, not this year, but last year, because what we also have been doing is we've been approving the calendar for 2 years as opposed to 1 year. So that's why we didn't have to do it this December. But since we're on the topic, just as a heads up, we will be at the March Ed Affairs, we will be submitting to the board a calendar revision for this school year, as we do almost every March, because remember, we build our calendar with snow days. And so the rationale is by mid-March, we should have a good handle on whether or not we're going to have any more inclement days. And then we back out the days that we built in for inclement weather that we have not used. And I remember kind of notoriously in 2020, when we met on a Monday to talk about the pandemic, we said, we have 4 snow days. We're going to use our 4 snow days this week to plan, to clean, to sanitize. And then, as you all know, we never came back after that date. So March is typically when we resubmit to the board any updates for the calendar for this school year. And typically it's all around backing out the inclement days and readjusting the last teacher day and readjusting the last student day to account for any inclement weather days we have or haven't used. From my recollection, we've only used one. It was I think a rainstorm or big, it wasn't a hurricane. What's in between? I guess like a tropical storm that we had in the fall. Would you say, Dr. Scriven?
I think it was a tornado that you guys had.
Yes, the tornado. So we took off for the tornado. So we would just back out 3 days as opposed to 4, because we've only lost that 1 day.
Got it. And I'm glad you brought up the recommendation that we recently approved, the most recent calendar approval, which was for 2 years, because I think what Mr. Diazio, you had it up on your screen. The policy actually, I think it shares it to determine annually the days and hours. But I guess the question is about whether or not, if our intent is to continue to improve this on a biannual basis, if this policy it needs to be revised to reflect the fact that we can either annually or biannually approve. I didn't even recognize that when we made the decision to go with the 2-year calendar, I believe last calendar cycle, but I did just recognize that in this moment, and just wanted to put that out there for the committee.
I would just say, I feel like annually gives us more flexibility, because some districts put their calendars up even for 3 years in advance to give families notice. So I just wanted to kind of put out there, I'm not against the update. I just want to point out that I think annually kind of, makes us revisit it in case we need to make any adjustments, updates, so on and so forth. But we've been very cautious not to make any changes, because we do want families to feel like this 2 years heads up is really a 2 years heads up, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Ms. Haywood?
Yeah, so excuse me, Dr. Smith, looking at this policy, so we basically approved the calendar for the following school year by December 31st of the prior year, correct? That's the timing.
Correct. So
And
at the December Ed Affairs of 2020, we approved the calendar for the 21-22 school year, and the 22-23 school year is already approved as well.
Okay, so I think kind of with that in mind, if we don't go beyond the December 31st date, we're giving parents approximately 6 months, well, more than that, 8 months notice of when school will start for the following academic year, which I think doesn't then raise the issue that we were trying to struggle with before when we were, and we still are planning like 2-year calendars. I think at the time there might have been some protracted discussion, and we may have had a delay in approving a calendar, which I think Mr. Bordeaux Williams raised the issue of putting in the AR with those parameters in there to give parents a little more advance notice. But I think with this timeline, I'm comfortable that that gives plenty of notice to families in advance of when the school year will start, for the following school year will start.
And if I could add one more final push to kind of keep it annual, one of the things that we run against, the calendar committee has been meeting actively this year. And there's been talk, especially as a result of the pandemic, for example, there's been conversation of the possibility of students being dismissed for a true half day every other Wednesday, to allow for teacher professional development, to allow for more services for our staff, because that's the one thing that we've heard consistently from all of our staff that they miss from when we were in a hybrid model. And during the times where we didn't have students in the buildings 5 days a week, is that our staff really grew and really benefited from the additional PD time. And so we already know our current faculty meeting days, for example, aren't true half days. Some students are dismissed at 1 o'clock, some students are dismissed at 2 o'clock. And so the calendar committee has been talking about, and remember, the calendar committee is comprised of parents, community members, teachers, as well as administrators. And so the conversation has gone to the direction of, can we get, say, every other half day? And so I've been talking to Dr. Scriven about this. I've been speaking to our Right at School program to see if they could accommodate students, because my first reaction as a working parent with an elementary school age child is, how is this going to impact parents if we're out every other week, every other Wednesday? And someone reminded me from the group, this is before my time in Cheltenham, they said, Dr. Smith, there was a time where Cheltenham dismissed early every Wednesday for faculty meetings and PD, so on and so forth. And so I reached out to our Right at School program, explained to them that this is something we were just thinking about. It was in the talking stages. And they assured me that based on their experience, based on the number of students that they serve, that they could host an after-school program every other Wednesday for parents who couldn't get to schools to pick up their children early. And they would either be charged a nominal fee or a drop-in fee for those services. So I say that to say, as we had that conversation, one of the things that came up was our 22-23 calendar is already in place. So if we make this recommendation and we like this recommendation, we kind of already put ourselves a year ahead with this calendar. So I guess that's my I guess input to possibly leave it annually, because something may happen where we may want to have an annual review and maybe not put a 2-year calendar forth if something like this that we're discussing now may be impacted. Just a thought.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I appreciate that context. And certainly while that specific piece is not the focus of today's meeting, I do see some heads. Is there any follow-ups to that? Board. Mr. Riddell Williams and then Dr. Smith.
Yeah, I was just going to share, right? Like just as long as as long as in moments where we decide to adopt a calendar that's longer than 1 year, that the committee and administration believes that we are still meeting the intent of our policy, I'm actually okay. My comment, and Dr. Smith, you brought up a lot of very good points. Like my comment was just around the fact that this was my first recollection of the fact that that this policy was written in such a way that I felt could be counter to our biannual approval of the most recent calendar cycle.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. I saw Mr. Diazio and Dr. Smith both unmute. Did either of you want to share more? Okay, thanks, Dr. Smith. Mr. Diazio, did you have a response?
No, I was just, well, not in response to the discussion, but when we get back to the AR, we can decide what we want to do with the AR, because I'm thinking that maybe we've determined that we don't need that AR. But feel free to continue the discussion, and when we get there, we'll get there.
That's where I was going next as well. I do see Ms. Haywood hand raised.
So Mr. Diazzo, you read my mind, but I'm thinking that we may not need to scrap the AR. I mean, I think maybe scrap the current language in the AR and replace it with, process. So I know that Dr. Smith, the CIPD committee, and we don't necessarily have to name the committee, but that in developing the calendar, the board and district will seek, input from a cross-section of parents, students, administrators, whatever, be in establishing the annual board calendar, because I do think that is a process that we have utilized. And I think it's important to memorialize that as part of the AR.
Thank you, Dr. Scriven.
Thank you. I was going down the same path as Mrs. Haywood, that I do think that the current AR should be adjusted to reflect process, and then also memorialize the fact that the calendar may be voted on biannually, but to keep the flexibility of explaining that we also need to make adjustments annually if needed. So just within that AR, if we can memorialize the explanation of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're the process for getting to that end result, I just think language around that would provide some clarity. I don't think the current language is beneficial at all.
Thank you for that, Dr. Scriven. And so to Mr. Diazio's earlier point, going back to the agenda item is 803 AR. And so there's been some comments around adjusting the language. Mr. Diazio, do you want to just resolve us around this?
Yeah, so what we can do is, I was taking notes with what Ms. Haywood was saying and Dr. Scriven. We can bring this back for next month with some revised guidelines. I think I have a good sense as to what the committee and administration are saying. So we can bring this back next month for the committee to take a look at. There's nothing, you don't need to move this forward or anything like this, because it's just an AR at this point. But we'll bring this back next month.
Thank you. And as a point of information, in terms of reporting out from the committee, our ARs included as something that we would need to report out on in terms of action that's happening there?
I'm trying to think of what the prior practice is. Ms. Haywood may be able to help me out here. There's no legal requirement, but I'm not sure what the prior practice is.
So usually I do report out just by naming the related AR when we're talking about an accompanying policy, but because the board does not approve ARs in this instance, this probably would not be on the agenda for the legislative meeting. But when it does come up on the legislative meeting, it'll just be listed typically. So you'll have policies for adoption, first read policies, and then you have a listing of ARs. And so you would just report out that, 803, AR 803 related to the school calendar was discussed during the meeting.
Thank you, Thibault. All right, I will hand it back to Mr. Diazio and Ms. Tolbert Jackson to move forward to policy in AR 510.
So 510 is the overtime policy. We proposed moving it to the 300 series where all of the HR policies are going now. The policy is very broad, and I'll pull up the AR here. There's really very little difference in the language from prior policy and the current policy. But I've been having some issues in board docs with the old formats when we try to edit the formats that are in there. The formatting gets all messed up. So sometimes you'll see that new language is presented, even though it says a lot of what was in the prior language. And that's the reason for that. It's really about board docs functionality than anything else. But the policy and the AR are pretty simple, essentially require that administrative permission be given before overtime is worked, that the supervisor, take steps to ensure that the overtime is necessary and be prepared to articulate why it was approved, if it was approved, and provide, direction to employees that they're not permitted to work overtime without getting that prior permission. That's the overall scope of it.
Thank you, Mr. Diazio. Any comments, questions from directors?
Ed, I just have a question. Do you think the collective bargaining agreement should be referenced in this policy or AR?
We can add language. A lot of times what we do or have done in the past is we could add a note to this policy that says that nothing in this policy is intended to be counter to the CBA, and to the extent there is a difference between the policy and the CBA would govern, which is how that would play out. I can't imagine a situation where, because of how broadly the overtime policy was written, there would be a difference. But to your point, noting that there is a collective bargaining agreement for the support staff, that might be helpful. I could add that note if the committee's comfortable with that.
Ms. Haywood?
I just have maybe interpretation question in terms of what would take priority or precedent. So this policy, I'm sure, is complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is listed. So to the extent that the CBA, for some reason, I doubt it would be, but if it were contrary to the Fair Labor Standards Act, would that still govern, or we would have to be governed by applicable law, correct?
Yeah, the CBA has to be written in such a way that it complies with applicable law. And to the extent that it's not, the law would override.
So should we add kind of that nuance there in terms of interpretation and precedent? What takes precedent?
We certainly could do that, sure.
Thanks, Ms. Haywood. And seeing no other hands raised from members or public, directors or members of the public, we'll move forward. This is first read on a conversion. And so my understanding is we'll still take board action on this as a first read. And I'll hand it over back to administrators to move forward to the next policy.
Next policy is policy 453, professional development, that we're proposing to change to 353 to convert to the 300 series.
Yes, and this is a new, I'll go to the 453 policy that was in place. You can already see over here all of the formatting issues with these citations. But what I noticed in my review is that PSBA has, in the last couple of years, consolidated a lot of the professional development requirements. There's a lot of requirements around teacher induction programs, professional education plans. A lot of this was discussed in the old 453, but the new PSBA recommendation was a little bit more detailed, and I actually thought the committee would appreciate this level of detail. So I actually proposed a new 353 here that's consistent with PSBA's recommendations. It includes the new requirements that you'll see here on the screen around trauma-informed education that were adopted into the law a couple years back. That was actually what prompted PSBA to make some changes to this policy. And all of the applicable provisions of the school code are hyperlinked right in this document, which was another nice feature of utilizing the PSBA template. And I'll need to, before we get to the board approval, I'm just realizing here that there's a date that I'll work with Ms. Jackson to enter into here as to when employees are required to report their credits for graduate courses.
Ed, we could put June 25th, because all of our tuition reimbursement forms for both BC, CA, and administration say the information has to be received by June 25th.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Pimental. Is your hand raised?
Just some questions about the policy, if this is the right time to ask.
Sure.
So under the induction plan section, it mentions that that induction is something that is included for long-term substitutes hired for a position for 45 days or more, but it doesn't specify timing. So just want to clarify, if we hire a long-term substitute in November and they work for 46 days, and then that's the end of their term with us, does this policy require us to give that individual their own induction programming since they're a mid-year hire? It just doesn't specify that. So that's one question that I have.
And if I could add to Matt's question, our long-term substitutes work at least 90 days in most circumstances. But sometimes they're hired second semester. So would we have to develop a separate induction for them? Because currently we do not.
So I can go back and look at the requirements around induction for long-term substitutes. What I know is that experienced teachers who are new to the district, but are not new teachers. So teachers in one school district and now they come to another school district. Right now, this policy reads that they would go through induction. I know that the district has flexibility to say those teachers don't necessarily have to go through another induction program. So if you have a teacher that's got 10 years experience, but they're new to Cheltenham, this policy would read that that teacher would go through induction. But that's an area where the district has flexibility, and some districts would not require that teacher to go through induction. So that's a point that we can discuss. I'll need to go back and look at the specific language on long-term substitutes because I don't know that off the top of my head. It's not a provision, obviously, that comes up very frequently, but I will go back and research that before the next meeting. Thank you for the question.
Ed, we do require all of our new teachers to participate in induction, even our tenured teachers.
Okay, so then the language that's in there now is reflective then of current practice.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Pimentel, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so just my next question is in the trauma-informed approaches section. So I understand that what's being captured in this section relates to requirements that we have around a legal requirement that we have to provide training related to trauma-informed practices. My question is, if for some reason in the future the law were to change, but our policy does not change, would we have to continue to honor what's in the policy here, even if there's no more legal requirement to provide that training? And this isn't a setup like I'm not positioning against trauma-informed PD. I think that's great. But just thinking, 10, 15 years from now, if that's no longer a legal requirement, would this policy require us to provide it anyway?
So if the law changed, we could always bring the policy back and look at it. Right now, the way it's written, it says there shall be an hour of trauma-informed approaches in accordance with law. So I actually think if the law goes away, I would read that as still requiring an hour of training, but there's probably different people could have different interpretations of what that would mean. Historically, what we've done is when the law changes, we would bring that policy back and make adjustments. And we do that from time to time with policies that change as the law changes.
Thank you, Ms. Haywood.
Yazio, could we go up to the professional education plan section? So is this also new language regarding, because I don't recall for the first paragraph having, parents and guardians and representatives of the community and local businesses reviewing a professional education plan?
So the language
Not that it's a bad idea, but I just didn't recall that.
The language that's here, I believe, and I'll pull it up here. Is a requirement of section 1205.1 of the school code, where it says the committee shall include, parents, local business representatives. So it's in the school code. This section was adopted in 2000 and some of this looks older. Some of it looks old, but some of it also looks like 2017 or 2019. I'd have to look at when exactly this language was put in, but it is a school code requirement at this point. I don't know how I don't know that PDE does any type of enforcement at all around this, and I think it's probably very broadly interpreted. But in writing the policy, I wrote it as narrowly as possible to just state what the law said. So that's where that language comes from.
Okay, so I just want to, point that out, that that's a piece of the policy that we would have to make sure that we comply with, whether that is, in a board committee meeting to get that input or otherwise. There's also a reference, I think, in that portion of the policy regarding a professional education committee. And I'm not sure, Mr. Pimentel, if we have such a
Yeah.
committee.
So I believe that falls under our comprehensive planning committee around professional development.
And do we also then every 3 years provide the professional education plan to the Secretary of Education for approval?
Yeah, I believe that's part of the comprehensive planning.
Okay. Okay, I just wanted to point that out to make sure that if those are new requirements, that we obviously knew we needed to meet those.
Thank you, Ms. Hayward. So follow up to the trauma-informed approach, the 1 hour requirement, and how much time is that have to be fulfilled? Is that annual? Is that in the 3 years? Or like how much time does that 1 hour have to be filled?
So the trauma-informed, so the plan, and Matt may know this better than me, but the plan covers a certain number of years, correct, Matt? So it's 1 hour in that plan. I don't believe it's 1 hour per year.
No, it's not 1 hour per year.
Yeah. And the plan
So it's-
covers 3 years, correct?
Mhm.
Yes.
So it would be 1 hour in 3 years.
Thanks. Thanks. I'll leave that at that for now. Yeah, I'll leave that at that for now. Seeing no other hands from directors, this is another first read for conversion. So we'll revisit this March 8th and we can move forward. Last item for today, 407.
Yes, and that's the student teachers policy. Recommending a pretty broad policy with guidelines contained, you'll see in the administrative regulation. So we could start, I'll leave the policy up here for a second. If there's any questions on the policy, and then if we want to move to the AR, we can do so, if that's okay with you, Mr. Epps.
I'm comfortable with that and seeing no hands from directors or administrators or members of the public. We can do that.
And then here's the AR. Pretty straightforward. Student teachers get assigned by the district. They're required to comply with our policies. They report, to the building principal. Ultimately, the teacher maintains responsibility for the classroom, and because the student teacher is there in a learning role. Those are the types of things that played out in this language. This was one of the last HR policies that needed to be converted to an employee policy, as opposed to it was in the 400 section.
Ed, I have a question. The 407 had an attachment. It was the student teacher acknowledgement form that they had to sign. So will that also be included with this one, or is that no longer required?
So if there is a form that you have student teachers sign, send it to me and we can place it in here. As things had moved to electronic, some of our forms had gone away because there's less paper, and some of the forms that were in our old policies, my understanding was they actually weren't being used anymore because things were being done electronically. But if you have something that student teachers do sign, we can certainly attach it. Everything that was in that form, though, I tried to make sure that it was contemplated in the AR so that nothing is missed, and student teachers would still be bound by this policy and all the AR requirements.
Okay, thank you. I'll run it by Dr. Smith to see if it's still needed.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Ms. Topor Jackson. I'm not aware of your preference just yet. You can let me know. And so seeing no other comments or no other hands raised from participants today. This also first read will move forward to our agenda for the March 8th legislative board meeting. And I believe that brings us to the end of our agenda items for new business.
Mr. Epps, did you want to go back and seek approval of the minutes at this point?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So we will do that now that we have achieved our committee quorum. And so we'll go back to our first agenda item for approval of minutes from the January 26, 2022 Policy Committee meeting. I will await a motion.
So move, Charles Burdell Williams.
I'll second that. Julie Haywood.
Hearing those motions, I will call the vote to approve the minutes of January 26, 2022 Virtual Policy Committee meeting. All ayes.
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? No. All right, the minutes have been approved, and with that brings us to we've closed for our agenda. I believe we do need a motion for adjourn for committee meetings. Yes.
You can take one.
Okay. Oh yeah. Yes. I'll
adjourn the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. With that, today's meeting is adjourned. Thank you to the administrators for the presentation. We'll see you soon.